So much for that introduction, and thank you so much to everyone for tuning in today. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all. I know we only have a short period of time together and a lot to cover, so I'm gonna try to get into it as quickly as possible. But before we get into the demonstration itself, I did want to give just a little bit more background leading into this webinar today. So just a little bit about me. My name's Mingo. I've worked in the data and analytics space for pretty much my entire career. Prior to coming to Plotly, I worked more on the data cleaning side, getting the data into the right formats, the right shape, for doing the analytics stuff. And after doing that for about 5 years or so, I realized that actually working on these projects where you get to build cool things and get really cool business insights was a lot more exciting. So I made a little bit of a pivot, and I've been with Plotly ever since. And during my time at Plotly, I've been fortunate enough to partner with ODSC several times on workshops, really hoping to see some folks at the conference in May. But in addition to working in the data and analytics space, I've also had an opportunity to really engage with people in all sorts of different industries on tons of different types of projects. And we'll be covering some example applications here today during this webinar. And obviously today is going to have a little bit more of an AI focus, how you can incorporate AI into your applications, and also use things like large language models to build those applications. And across all those different industries like life sciences, government, financial services, the regulated industries, I know that AI is a really top of mind topic, and there are a lot of questions about how these sorts of technologies can be used while still respecting those regulations. So we're hoping to speak a little bit more about that today as well. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with Plotly, I did want to just spend a minute or two explaining a little bit more about what it is that we do. And by far, the most common question I get when I tell people that I work at Plotly is the free Python package for building graphs. We're very well known in the data science and analytics communities because we have a graphing utility called plotly.js. It's a JavaScript package for building interactive data visualizations. Now, it's a JavaScript package, but the vast majority of people who are using Plotly are Python coders. And that's going to be the focus for today's webinar, is building applications using some of those Python libraries. Now, we've been around for a little over a decade now, and in that time, we've obviously been focused on the data visualization side of things. But even more than that, we're really focused on building interactive web applications. So not just individual line charts and bar charts, but actually putting all of these different data visualizations together into not just dashboards, but what we call data applications. And the reason we make that distinction between dashboards and data apps is that with an application, you're not just viewing some stuff on a screen, but you're actually able to trigger downstream actions. You want to do things like running a forecasting model, updating a record, making a call out to a large language model. That's an example we can talk about today. All sorts of different things you might want to do from that front end. Our libraries help you do that. And again, we're used all over the data and analytics communities. We have tens of millions of downloads every single month. A lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today, while there will be a little bit of a focus on some of our enterprise capabilities as well, will relate to the open source libraries. So after this webinar, I really hope that if you haven't tried out our open source offerings before, that you give it a shot and start building some really cool applications. I'll also just quickly mention that we are very seldom used in a vacuum. Usually people are using Plotly and Dash, that package for building applications, alongside the other tools within their data stack. Databricks is a really commonly used one where a ton of customers of Databricks are using Plotly. So you can see in the center here, back in 2024, they found that we were the most widely used data and AI product within their partner ecosystem. So if there are other sorts of tools that you're already using today and you want to incorporate those into this data and analytics pipeline, Plotly and Dash are going to slide into that whole workflow very, very nicely. After this webinar, if you have any questions about getting started building applications, there are a lot of great resources out there. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we have a huge, huge open source community. So there are all the normal channels like YouTube, Stack Overflow, but something that's really awesome about Plotly is that we also have a community forum run by a colleague of mine, and we do regular data challenges. We have forums where people can post and ask questions and share the cool things that they're building. So if after this webinar, you've hopefully gotten an appetite for all the cool things you can do with Plotly and Dash, definitely check out our open source community forum, and you'll have plenty of places for getting started. Now, with all of that being said, I did also want to spend just a moment talking about Dash Enterprise, which is really going to allow you to make that leap from building individual kind of one-off applications running on your laptop to full-blown deployed production applications with things like SSO authentication in front of them, scaling so that you can support thousands or tens of thousands of users at the same time, additional packages for giving you more capabilities like reporting and embedding within your websites. Not an exhaustive list by any means, but during the webinar today, in addition to talking about just base Dash and how you can get started building applications, we'll talk about some techniques and some capabilities for making those apps more fully featured, and also for deploying them and sharing them with lots of different people. So with all that being said, I personally hate just talking and showing slides. I want to make sure that we actually get into showing you all some actual software and code. So without any further ado, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and move into a demonstration of how you can get started building apps. And where I'm actually going to start today isn't with the traditional Dash workflow, which is a little bit more coding intensive. We'll get into that a little bit later for those of you who are already familiar with Dash and how it works. But I wanted to show an even simpler way to get started. And this is within something that we've been working really hard on over the past several months called App Studio. What App Studio allows you to do is take very simple code or even just a data set to start and then build an application from that using a variety of tools like UI and AI. So you can see on this landing page here that I have a bunch of different options. I can start from a template or I can start from a data set. In this case, I'm going to click upload your data. I'm going to select a file to use as our jumping off point. And then you can see that as soon as I upload that data set, I'm brought to a Jupyter notebook, an interactive Python script where I'm able to start exploring that data set and playing around with that. So all we've done so far is upload a data set. I haven't written a single line of code yet, but App Studio helps me along the way. It knows that I've uploaded that data set, knows I probably want to view it in the table, so it's going to automatically generate that code for me to read in and display that table. And you can see that we have some company information about prices over time. So that's a good starting point. But maybe what I can do then is start to use some of these pieces of functionality to begin building our notebook and our application. So I have two buttons here, Explore and AI Chat. I'm going to start with the Explore button on the left. So when I click that, it'll bring me to a new screen where if I want to make any modifications to the data or better understand the underlying data set, I have this summary view. I can also define custom filters and aggregation functions if I want to change the shape. In this case, this is a pretty simple data set, so we don't really need to do any manipulations, but the option's there if we want it. And then getting into the really interesting part, actually starting to build analytics on top of this. So you may notice on the right-hand side, we have this plot chart button. And when I click that, that brings up a screen where I'm able to start building any sort of data visualization that I want. So in this case, maybe I want to build a line chart. For my x-axis, I'm going to choose date. And over time, I want to view those stock prices. And then more than that, I want to separate this out by the company that we're looking at. So you can see with just a few button clicks, we're able to get this visualization. And for those of you who might not have experience yet with Plotly, Something that's pretty cool about the plotly graphs that you build is that they're not just static images. I can actually hover over different parts of the graph to display information about the underlying data. Now I can zoom into the parts of the graph that I care about. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we start talking about Dash, which is the package for building applications. But interactivity within graphs is one thing. Building interactivity between different components is something else entirely. And that's something that Dash makes really easy. So again, going to our graph here, I have a pretty good starting point. Maybe I want to tweak it a little bit. I'm going to add a title, and that looks pretty good. That's a good starting point, first visualization. I can see the underlying code for that graph we've generated, and then I can insert that back into this notebook that's serving as the basis for the application that we'll eventually be developing. So that's step one, is any stuff that I want to manually add just by using that user interface, I'm able to do so. And probably goes without saying, but if I wanted to instead live purely in code and write this code myself, I could do that as well. Now, scrolling back up here to the data set, I'm actually going to try to build out something using a large language model. So I'm going to click this AI chat button. And very similar to that Explore button, which brought up a separate tab, that AI chat button is going to bring up a new chat window where I'm able to talk to a large language model and use that to start creating these visualizations. Now, I already have a line chart, so viewing price trends over time is probably going to be a little bit repetitive. So instead, I'm going to ask it to help me build a new, slightly more complex type of visualization. I'm going to go into my chat box at the bottom here. I'm going to say generate a box plot showing prices by company from 2000 to 2005. As I'm typing this in, it's going to make a call out to that model. It's going to think for a moment, and then it's going to generate a pretty good visualization to start. Just like that line chart that we generated on the previous screen, this is fully interactive, and I can see the underlying code to generate this. Notice how it's a little bit more complex than the previous example. Now, I don't just have to take this graph as is, I can ask it to make modifications. So I can say, for example, add a comparison to price data by company between 2006 and 2010. Hopefully that's enough for it to understand what I'm asking. So I'm gonna hit enter. And then again, it's gonna go ahead, it's gonna do some thinking. Oh, interesting. So in this case, it's not taking that context that I had before, it's actually generating a new graph. So AI isn't always gonna know exactly what I'm asking it to do. So in this case, I'm gonna say, instead of generating a new chart, create a box plot showing company price data from 2000 to 2005, and another showing data from 2006 to 2010. So that's the thing with large language models that's really nice, is that you're able to iterate, and without having to write any code, you can start to generate these visualizations. So now it has my two graphs, and I can scroll between them, but maybe I want to combine those two. So plot the two box plots for 2005 to 20, or 2000 to 2005 and 2006 to 2010 on the same axes. And there we go. We have this all in one really nice visualization. It's even color coded. I didn't have to tell it to do that. It just figured out that because I'm asking to do a comparison, it makes sense to add a legend and color that. And again, if we see the underlying code, it's a lot more than just one line of code. This large language model is helping us generate a lot more information. So I can add that back into my notebook and then display that visualization that we just created. Now, one thing that I can also do is I can take this starting point, this notebook, and I can use that as a basis for an application. So if I click this App Editor button within App Studio, it's going to take all of those tables that I've added, all those graphs that we've created, and it's going to turn that into an application. Instead of just looking at static output within a Python script, I'm able to actually interact with these different components on the page. And I can also tweak this. So maybe instead of having all these different components on the page take up half of the width of the screen, maybe I want to have a graph section. And I want to move some of these components in there. So I'm going to take this line chart and this box plot. I'm going to put them in there. And then I want to make the table take up the full width. I want to make the graphs take up half of the width. Right, pretty easy to create one of these applications and then start to tweak it. Now, one other thing about Dash that's, I'd say, particularly powerful is the ability to take input from the user and use that input to modify what's being displayed on the screen and also to trigger whatever code you want downstream from the application. Now, I'm going to show a very simple example here. And to do that, I'm actually going to go up here. I'm going to add a new cell. Now, notice how I have the option to create controls using a UI if I want to. I personally am a little more familiar with code. So I'm going to ask it instead to create a code cell. And in that code cell, I want to create a dropdown. Now, this is going to require a little bit more Dash know-how. So just bear with me here. I'll explain everything after I type it. But I'm going to be importing a component library that will let me define these interactive UI controls. So what I'm doing here, DCC stands for Dash Core Components. That's our way of building these interactive UI components within our application. So I want to create a dropdown that'll let me select the different companies. So I'm going to say, if I could spell, I want to populate that dropdown with all the unique values in that company column. Similarly, I want this to initially have all those companies selected, and then I'm going to give it a third parameter, multi. So that's saying that this is a multi-select. And then I'm going to save that to a variable. Right? So now when I run that cell, I forgot to say what that was, drop down dot value. Right, so now I have that line of code that will give me those values that I've selected. Right, so I can print that in my notebook, that list of the companies. So having that list is fine, but the more interesting thing is what we can do with this. So rather than just displaying these graphs on the full data set, I want to make these graphs react to the dropdown that I'm interacting with. So I'm going to create a new data frame. And I'm going to say only show me the data that's been selected from that dropdown. Now, when I run this cell of code, naturally, it's going to give me the exact same data frame because I'm selecting all the different values. But if you just bear with me for a moment, I'm going to show you how this all comes together in the application that we're building. Now, I want to take these graphs that I've created using AI and using the UI, and I want to make them respond to that dropdown. So instead of operating off of the full data set, I'm instead going to modify these to operate off of the filtered data set. Right, so I'm going to rerun those, going to save this, and then when I go back to this app editor and resync this, notice how we have this new section of our app at the top where we're not just viewing the graphs that we created. Notice how that filtered data set that I added is in here now too, but we also have this drop down at the top. And what that allows us to do is without having to write any code, I can just interact with those drop down values and then it'll filter all of the components on the page that rely on that drop down. So maybe now that I have this filtered data set, I don't want to view the full data set. So I can see more clearly that as I make changes to this dropdown, it's responding to what I'm selecting. So in just a few short minutes, using large language models, using code, and using our UI, we're able to build a pretty sophisticated application. Now, I realize for many of you who are joining this webinar, you might not have experience with the more complex things you can do with Dash, and we'll cover that a little bit later. But everything that we built using this workflow, and by the way, even if there's stuff that doesn't directly affect the execution of the app, like the summary of what the app is or the title, I can tweak those things as well. So I have this starting point for my application. I want to take this a little bit further. Well, App Studio also gives you the ability to generate all of the underlying code. Now, I understand this might be a little bit overwhelming to folks who haven't seen Dash before, or even to those who have played around with Dash before. It's a lot of code. But the really nice thing about all this code that you're seeing here is that I didn't need to write this myself. This is all stuff coming directly from that workflow. All right. So I know that was a pretty quick run through of that initial application. I know that the folks who are tuning in today probably have an interest in seeing some live data as well. So I want to make sure that I'm able to show that as well. I can see in the chat that there's some questions about combining live and static data sources. So I will preface this by saying I don't unfortunately have access to an actual live data source, but I'm going to show you all the building blocks so that you could connect to a live data source next. So I'm going to shift over to this second notebook, and just to clean up my screen a little bit, I'm going to close some of these tabs. So I've done a little bit of prep work for this second example. In addition to reading in a data set, you also have the ability to import whatever Python packages you want. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, unfortunately, I don't have access to a live data source right now, but what I do have access to are all the Python libraries at our disposal. So I'm going to just generate some random live data myself and show you how that can be incorporated into an application. And by the way, if you had an actual live data source and the credentials for accessing it, you do have a data sources tab over here where you would be able to make that connection. So what I'm doing in here, I'm just going to run these lines of code. So I'm importing some packages that are going to help me. Also notice how when I hover over this, it shows me the documentation. That's pretty nice. And then here's where we're going to generate our live data. So I'm first defining this function to take a number and then generate 100 points of data based on that number. And just to make sure this example is as realistic as possible for a live data example, I want to make sure that this information is going to be somewhat consistent. So I'm going to seed that random number generator. Now down here, this gets into the live piece. Within a Dash application, the way that you're typically going to be doing anything more real-time is going to be through what we call an interval component. And I'm actually going to bring up a docs page just to explain this a little bit more. So think of an interval almost like a stopwatch, where in your layout, and ignore a lot of this stuff. We'll get into that a little bit later once we get into kind of more the heavy duty coding. But this is the piece that's the most important. It's that same DCC dash core components. Again, think of that interval like a stopwatch. You give it a name, and then you say, how often is that stopwatch going to tick? So in milliseconds, you say what that interval is going to be. In this case, it's saying run every second. And every second that it's running, we're going to make it do something. So going back into App Studio here, I'm defining one of those stopwatches. And then what we're saying is save that kind of tick of the stopwatch to this variable, update number. Now, what I'm doing in this data frame that I'm defining, rather than reading in a data set, we're generating our own live data set. So I'm going to have two columns in here. We're going to have seconds. That's just going to be a number. And then we're going to have the values, just kind of a numeric value. You can let your mind fill in what that might be. It could be stock prices. It could be voltage, whatever. It doesn't really matter too much. But we have time, we have our value, and then we generate that data frame based on that. So, that's our starting point. And just like with the previous example, we can start to generate some analytics. So why don't we start with AI chat? I'm going to bring up that chat box. And then maybe I want to leave it a little bit more open-ended. Tell me two interesting figures we could generate. So it's going to go to our large language model. Again, going to do some thinking. And this will just take a moment, but after it goes ahead and does that thinking, it's going to give us back some interesting visualizations that we can use. So this first one is a histogram where it's showing us all the different values that are being generated. Right? And we can see the underlying code for that. It's using that same Plotly library and generating that histogram for us. And then it's hopefully going to generate a second one. It says generate a scatter plot of X versus Y. This is the downside of using stuff like AI. Sometimes you need to ask it to do something again. So I'm going to hit that button. And again, it's going to make a call out to that model. It's going to generate those visualizations for us. So we have our graphs. This first one looks good. I'm going to add that to my notebook. Ooh. Value of X. I didn't get the column name, so I'm going to make some tweaks. So I'm going to make X second, or value rather. Hopefully that will work. There we go. And then for that second one, if we go back here, I don't actually love this being a scatter plot. I want it to be more like a real-time data feed where, I probably am going to do that with a line chart. So I'm going to take this into my own hands. I'm going to go back to our UI builder, and I'm going to create a chart where on the x-axis, we're going to have seconds, and on the y-axis, we're going to have that value. And I said I wanted to make a line chart, so why don't we change that figure type? Cool. That's exactly what I want. I'm going to insert this back into my notebook as the second graph. And with that, with just a few button clicks, we're able to generate that starting point for our real-time application. Now, for anyone who's familiar with how Python works, and more specifically Jupyter Notebook works, you'll see that when you run lines of code, it kind of just gives you some static output. But when we turn this into a Dash application, it's going to start to make this more interactive. So all those Dash components, like our interval, are going to be able to run fully within that application environment. So just like with the previous example, I'm going to click App Editor. It's going to take those things that I've put into my notebook, and it's going to turn those into an application. And again, I promised that this would be a more live example. And you can see that here, where think of this like, again, a stopwatch. Every second, it's incrementing by one, and it's only showing me the 100 most recent points of data. So in the table, that's maybe a little bit harder to understand. But as we get down here into the graphs, that's where we start to get a little bit more interesting. These visualizations are updating live every single second. And down here, looking at our line graph, you could very easily imagine this is, looking at a live data source, like a data warehouse or a data lake. And every second, we're getting that new point of data, we're shifting everything over, and we're just looking at the most recent data. So pretty neat stuff. Get a little bit perhaps convoluted with generating our own real-time data, but I wanted to make sure that everything that we're showing to you today doesn't just rely on having access to specific types of sources, but I want to make sure that we're giving you the tools you need to start building these sorts of applications yourself. All right, so with all that being said, we've seen some examples of how you can use large language models to build applications. I want to shift gears a little bit and just show you some slightly more advanced examples of how you can incorporate AI into the final applications that you've built. So go into our page here. This is the landing page within our Dash Enterprise platform. If you build your own Dash apps yourself without our enterprise platform, that's fine. You just won't have this UI to access them. But every single rectangle on this page represents a different application that we've built. So why don't we start with something a little bit simpler. This is more of I call it traditional visualization dashboard, where we have kind of like the example we just built, the filters so we can navigate to different subsets of the data. We have some data cards, we have a table. So how does AI fit into all this? Well, obviously, AI has a lot of potential applications for the development lifecycle, as we just saw. But it also has potential applications for your end users. Now, one thing that large language models are really good at is taking context and taking information, turning that into summaries. That's one of the packages we've actually built into our enterprise offering, is the ability to take one of those data visualizations and then generate some insights based on it. And without understanding anything about the underlying data, I'm able to get the summary of what is it that I'm looking at. And maybe I want to understand a little bit more. I want to interrogate the underlying data. Tell me more about the plateau data, for example. Hit enter. It's going to do what large language models do best. It's going to take that input that I've given it and then turn that into some output. In this case, some very granular output about the different types of values, the range. So that's one potential application of LLMs, is that you can use it to summarize what's going on in your application. Now, one other really cool way that you can use LLMs, this is an app that one of my colleagues built out, is you can use it to actually modify the stuff within the application itself. So here, just to kind of set the stage a little bit, we have an example application where we're looking at the financial stress index, basically a measure of the level of stress on financial markets in the United States. And we're tracking that metric over time. It's kind of straightforward. It's just a time series graph. But notice how we have these toggles at the bottom. When I click on these toggles, it's going to take those visualizations that I've created. It's going to go to a large language model, and it's going to find relevant world events and overlay those on the graphs themselves. So again, this isn't really for developers so much as for your end users. If they're used to interacting with large language models in this interactive way, you can do that to modify the actual content of the applications themselves. And you can also add things like chatbots directly into your app. So maybe I don't have the best memory of what happened a couple decades ago. In my defense, I was relatively young back then compared to now. So I'm going to go into this chat box and I'm going to ask it what happened in 2008 that may have affected the FSI. Oh, what a surprise. There was a global financial crisis that seemed to have some pretty direct implications on the financial markets in the US. So just a couple quick examples there, but I wanted to show these as a way of illustrating, don't think of LLMs as just a tool that you have as a developer. It's also something that you can make available to your end users so that they're able to incorporate these capabilities into their day-to-day workflows. So we've shown some example applications there. I do want to take just a few minutes before we go back to a Q&A more formally to address what Dash is a little bit more generally, because we've kind of shown the simple way of building Dash apps. We've shown some examples, but I want to kind of pop that hood open a little bit more for anyone who isn't as experienced with coding. I hope this will be a useful primer for you. I want to just show a little bit more behind the scenes of what we were building earlier using App Studio. So this is what's going to be available to you as you're getting started with our open source. It's going to be a coding-based framework. So what that framework allows you to do, some of this is going to be very familiar to anyone who's worked with Python before, lets you import whichever libraries you want to use, lets you define some helper functions. And then what I always tell folks when they're learning Dash for the first time is that there are two really important parts to building a Dash application. Parts, by the way, that obviously App Studio kind of abstracted away. But the first is building the content of your app. What's going to show up on the screen? And that's what we're showing here, our layout, where you say the different things you want to put on the page. Things like drop-downs, graphs, tables, etc. Now, in addition to building that user interface that the end user can interact with, and I can show you that live on the right-hand side, this is that app that's being generated from the code I've written. So in addition to generating that UI, Dash also gives you, as the developer, the ability to define those interactions. I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with this is probably the single most complicated and hard to understand concept within Dash. It's also the most powerful. So hopefully I do a good job. If there's any confusion there, definitely let me know in the comments. I am taking a look at them. But what these callback functions allow you to do is very succinctly say, what are the inputs the user can play around with on the page? What are the outputs that are going to get updated? And what code are we actually running in order to do that update? So here I'm saying the input is our dropdown. We identify it with that name, title dropdown. And what we're saying is basically set up a listener. Pay attention to the value that's been selected in that dropdown. And anytime it changes, it's going to automatically run that callback function you've defined below it. Now, when that function runs, what are we going to update? We're going to update the figure property, basically what's being shown on the screen for our first graph within our application. How are we doing that update? It's with whatever code we've written down below. We're getting our data set, we're filling in null values, we're doing a calculation, and then this is the important piece, return back a plotly line graph where we're using that preprocessed data set and we're setting that y-axis to match whatever value it is that the user selected, right? Y equals dropdown value. So I select Apple, it displays the Apple data. Pretty cool stuff. But you don't have to take my word for it. Staying on theme with large language models, one thing that can be really helpful for not just the kind of more introductory developers who'd be using something like App Studio, but also for your more advanced developers who are working within an IDE, is the ability to use large language model-based tools to make that coding faster and easier. So rather than trying to understand what's going on in this function that someone's written, I can go in and I can use my AI to generate some documentation for us. It's going to do what large language models do. It's going to take the context that I've given it. It's going to take just a few seconds to process that request. But ultimately what it's going to do, hopefully if the connection hasn't timed out, is it's going to generate some documentation for us. And more generally, I know that the specific tools that we're showing today might be tools that you don't currently have a subscription to, but all the concepts that we're covering around, using large language models to generate code, using it to generate documentation. And I just see it says it timed out. I'm gonna try refreshing the page and see if that works. And if it doesn't, then hopefully the explanation will at least be good. So I'm gonna try that one more time. I'm gonna ask it to document the code. Again, all these concepts that we're covering today, whether it be using the specific tools that I've been using in the webinar, or using your own tools like ChatGPT, Cursor, etc., all these same concepts will apply and hopefully be helpful for your development workflows. All right, the perils of a live demo. Looks like my connection is unfortunately timed out, but hopefully at least the explanation made it clear how you can incorporate AI into these workflows. Now, before I turn it back to the Q&A and start going through some of your questions, I did want to take just one last moment to show you where you can go to find more information about applications that you can build with Plotly and Dash, as well as more about the framework itself. So if you go to plotly.com/examples, or just go to our website and go to example apps, it'll take you to the same place. You can see tons of examples of different apps that both our team and members of our community have built out. And in keeping with the AI theme, we have an entire section dedicated to generative AI and large language models. So if you want to see some cool examples from an end user perspective and also interrogate the code so you can understand how they work, have at it. There are a lot of really great examples there for you to take a look at. And if you want to learn a little bit more about Dash from the ground up, a great place to go is dash.plotly.com. That's our documentation site, which, by the way, is actually a really big Dash app. That's a pretty cool thing about Dash. And then in here, you'll see some quick start tutorials. This Dash in 20 minutes tutorial is actually very similar to a workshop that I've given several times at ODSC. So great place to get started if you want to learn the basics of building a Dash app. And then once you get into more advanced things like advanced callbacks, integrations with other systems, live data, etc., tons of different pages in here that you can use to explore those more advanced topics. And I'll just add one more shameless plug for the Plotly Community Forum. That's a really great place you can go to learn more as well. So with that being said, I'm just going to take a moment to look at some of the questions in the chat. I don't have time to answer all of them because I realize we're approaching the top of the hour. Apologies. But we'd love to follow up with you after the webinar. All right, so I see, for example, one question asked about which large language model Dash Enterprise uses. Great question. So we use different models for different parts of the platform. The App Studio AI chat that I showed you, in its current state, which is, think of it almost like a V1 because it's brand new. Currently, it's using OpenAI. The plans are to extend that to other large language models going forward. So if you need to use an on-premise LLM or you have some other provider that you have a subscription with, very soon you'll be able to start using those other models as well. I see another question. What tricks have you learned about writing the most effective prompts to get you the best results on this platform? Another great question. So to be honest, I don't think that there's anything specific to our platform per se. It's just using large language models in general. What I've learned is that sometimes just giving it as much context as possible can be the best way to get effective results. You probably remember from that example that I showed live maybe 10, 15 minutes ago in App Studio, I generated a box plot. I added it to add more data, and instead of giving it more data in that same box plot, it just kind of took that message in a vacuum and generated a completely separate visualization. And then to get it to do what I wanted, I said, no, 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 like don't generate something different. Take that existing box plot and then append to it. So I'm still candidly in the process of best learning how to use large language models in my day-to-day. It's a relatively new technology that's growing really quickly. But what I've found is that to get the best results, it can often be really helpful to be overly descriptive of what you want it to do. All right, I see some other questions about data pipelines and integrations. Absolutely. You can integrate Dash Enterprise, and just more broadly, you can integrate your Dash applications with other sorts of systems. You can do that using data source connectivity directly within Dash Enterprise. If I go to demo server, you can actually see some examples of this, where you can set up integrations with things like Snowflake, Databricks, custom data sources as well. If you prefer to live in code or you want to stay in the open source world, you can also use Python packages to connect to those systems live. I see another question in the chat about materials being shared after this. Just to confirm and reiterate something that was said, yes, we'll be sharing the recording and the slides after this. I realize we're entering the last several minutes. I do want to make sure that with the remaining time, I just have a few minutes to talk about some upcoming stuff from Plotly as well. So if you like what you see here and you want to learn more about building apps using AI more specifically with Dash Enterprise, we do have a webinar coming up on April 8th, just a couple weeks from now, where we'll be going even deeper into some of these capabilities with our product and engineering teams. So if you're interested in that, we'll be sending these slides afterwards, and we'll have that link so that you can navigate there and sign up. And I mentioned earlier that one of the best resources that we have at Plotly is the community forum. And every month, the Plotly community does some sort of data challenge where we ask folks to build cool applications and share them with the rest of the community. And this month, we're partnering with an organization called One for the World to try to address things like poverty. So we want to really encourage people to build really cool, impactful applications, hopefully with some data visualization in there. If you are curious in learning more about this app challenge, it's a great way to dip your toes in the water and learn from other experts in the Plotly community. So again, that link will be in the slides that we'll be sharing after this webinar. And I shared some of these resources earlier, but if you want to learn more about Plotly and Dash, visit our website, visit our docs, check out our GitHub if you want to see some of these libraries yourself. And then, of course, if you want to speak to someone like me or someone from my team and see a more in-depth demo of Dash Enterprise, feel free to visit our website and request a demo directly. We'd love to hear from you. So with that being said, I know we're reaching the end of our time here. I just wanted to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of you for tuning in. I know it's not a small task asking folks to dedicate an hour of their day to learning about Plotly and building cool data applications. So I really appreciate you all taking some time to join today's webinar. And thank you so much to the ODSC team for helping coordinate everything.